Yeah. I sat there while my daughter-in-law looked me in the eyes and called my life's work embarrassing, not knowing the entire mall around us belonged to me. What hurt wasn't the words, it was how easily she said them, like I was something to be hidden. In that moment, I realized she didn't misunderstand me. She had already decided who I was, and I let her, because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be told, it needs to be revealed. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from. And as you watch, don't just sit back, be part of the experience. If a moment grabs your attention, drop a comment and share your thoughts. My name is Margaret Collins, and most people who pass through Lakeview Galleria in Seattle would never guess who I really am. To them, I am simply the older woman standing behind a modest organic fruit stand near the west entrance, arranging apples into neat rows or wiping the soft fuzz from fresh peaches. They see my hands, slightly rough from years of work, and they assume I have spent my life doing nothing more than this. In a way, they are not entirely wrong. This stand has been a constant in my life for decades. What they do not see is everything that came before it, and everything that quietly surrounds it now. Each morning, I arrive before the mall fully wakes. The glass ceiling above catches the early gray light of Seattle mornings, and for a brief moment, the entire place feels still, almost untouched. I unlock the small wooden counter, check the crates of fruit delivered just before dawn, and begin arranging them with care. There is something grounding about this routine. The scent of oranges and strawberries, the gentle rhythm of stacking and sorting, the familiar faces of early customers who greet me with small, polite smiles. It is a life that appears simple from the outside, and I have allowed it to remain that way. What most people do not know is that I own everything they walk through. Lakeview Galleria, with its polished floors, high-end boutiques, and luxury apartments above, belongs entirely to me. It is not something I announce, nor something I feel the need to explain. The truth has a way of complicating interactions, and I have spent enough years learning how differently people behave when money enters the conversation. Remaining unseen in a way has become a quiet advantage. It was not always like this. 40 years ago, there was no mall, no glass ceiling, no elegant storefronts. There was only a narrow stretch of pavement and a wooden cart that my husband built with his own hands. We would wake before sunrise, drive across town to purchase whatever fruit we could afford, and spend the day hoping to sell enough to cover our costs. Some days, we barely did. Other days were just enough. But we kept going. He believed in something bigger long before I could see it. We saved slowly, carefully, every dollar accounted for. Eventually, we opened a small fruit shop in this very location. It was nothing special at the time, just a space with flickering lights and worn walls, but to us, it felt like progress. From there, things began to grow. We purchased neighboring units, repaired what others had abandoned, and slowly transformed the area into something people wanted to visit. It took years of risk, long nights, and more than a few moments of doubt, but piece by piece, Lakeview Galleria came to life. When my husband passed away, the silence he left behind was overwhelming. Along with it came the full weight of everything we had built, the ownership, the decisions, the responsibility. I could have stepped into a visible role, taken an office above the mall, and managed everything from a distance. Instead, I chose to stay here, at the fruit stand, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remember where it all began. There is a certain clarity that comes from being underestimated. When people believe you have little, they reveal far more about themselves. And over the years, I have learned to listen carefully to what they say and even more carefully to what they do not. If you're still here and already sensing something deeper beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The first time Ethan told me about Vanessa, there was something in his voice I had not heard before. It was not just excitement, and it was not uncertainty either. It was something steadier, something that suggested he had already made up his mind about her. When he asked if he could bring her to meet me at the fruit stand, I said yes without hesitation. Still, that morning, I found myself arriving earlier than usual, adjusting small details that normally would not have mattered. I wiped down the wooden counter twice, rearranged the apples until they looked perfectly even, and chose the freshest strawberries to place at the front. I told myself it was just habit, but I knew better. Around midday, I saw Ethan walking toward me from across the mall. He looked relaxed, but there was a quiet anticipation in the way he moved. Beside him was Vanessa. She carried herself with a kind of effortless precision that made people notice her without understanding why. Her clothes were elegant but not loud, her posture straight, her steps measured. When they reached the stand, Ethan introduced us, and Vanessa greeted me with a warm smile that felt carefully practiced. For the first few moments, everything appeared normal. We exchanged polite words, and I offered them both fruit. Ethan accepted immediately, just as he had done since he was a child, but Vanessa hesitated before reaching out. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, yet it lingered long enough for me to see it. She looked at the fruit, then at the stand, and finally at me. It was not curiosity, it was evaluation. Her eyes moved slowly across the space, taking in the wooden shelves, the handwritten price board, the arrangement of baskets. Then her gaze shifted beyond me, toward the rest of the mall. I followed her line of sight for a brief second. High-end stores, polished glass, carefully designed storefronts. When she looked back at me, there was a subtle change in her expression, something restrained, almost imperceptible. I had seen that look before, many times, in meetings long ago. It was the look of someone placing value where they believed it belonged. She asked how long I had been working there. I told her the truth, that it had been decades. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, not in admiration, but in mild surprise. She nodded, then glanced again at the surrounding stores. The conversation continued, but her attention never fully settled. Even when Ethan shared stories about helping me at the stand as a boy, Vanessa listened with polite interest, yet her eyes kept drifting. At one point, I noticed her glance at my hands. It was brief, but deliberate. The roughness of my skin, the small marks left by years of lifting crates and handling fruit, did not go unnoticed. Her expression did not change much, but it did not need to. Some judgments do not require words. Before leaving, she smiled again and said she admired people who worked hard. The sentence sounded kind, but the tone carried distance, as if she were speaking about something separate from herself. Ethan did not notice. He was happy, and that was enough for him in that moment. I watched them walk away through the mall, their figures gradually blending into the flow of shoppers. Vanessa's head turned slightly as they moved, her attention once again scanning the space around her. She was not just seeing where Ethan came from, she was studying it. Standing there, I realized something I could not ignore. First impressions are rarely as simple as they appear, and in that brief meeting, Vanessa had already shown me exactly how she saw the world. If that first impression gave you a strange feeling too, comment number 2 below, so I know you caught it. Now, let's continue to chapter 3. In the weeks that followed, Vanessa became a steady presence in Ethan's life, and by extension, in mine. At first, nothing seemed particularly unusual. She visited the mall often, sometimes with Ethan, sometimes alone. always composed, always courteous. Yet the more I observed her, the more I noticed a shift beneath the surface. Her politeness remained, but it began to feel structured, almost deliberate, as if every word had been carefully chosen for effect rather than sincerity. One afternoon, Ethan came to the fruit stand by himself. That alone was enough to catch my attention. He usually brought Vanessa along, or at least mentioned her before arriving. That day, he leaned against the counter in a way that felt heavier than usual. His shoulders were slightly tense, his movements slower, as if he had been carrying something he could not quite put down. He picked up an apple and turned it in his hand without really looking at it. I asked how his week had been, and he gave a vague answer before pausing. There was a hesitation that did not belong to him. Eventually, he admitted that Vanessa thought I worked too much. He said it carefully, almost as if he were translating someone else's opinion into something softer. According to her, I should not still be doing this kind of work at my age. He gestured lightly toward the stand, avoiding my eyes for a brief moment. I listened without interrupting. It was not what he said that mattered, but how he said it. He was trying to protect both of us at the same time, and that rarely works without cost. I asked him if she believed I needed help. He quickly denied it, but the pause before his answer told me everything I needed to know. Later that day, Vanessa joined us. Her arrival was as composed as always, her smile polite, her posture confident. She greeted me warmly, but within minutes, the conversation began to shift in a familiar direction. She asked if I had ever considered retiring. The question sounded harmless, even thoughtful, but it did not stand alone. It was followed by comments about how long I had been working, how demanding the job must be, and how, at a certain point, people should begin to enjoy a different kind of life. I responded simply, telling her that I enjoyed what I did. She smiled, but her eyes suggested she did not quite understand that answer. The conversation moved forward, yet she continued to return to the same idea, each time phrased slightly differently. She spoke about how people notice things, how appearances matter, and how certain impressions can affect opportunities. At one point, she mentioned that Ethan's colleagues had asked about his family. The way she said it carried a subtle weight, as though the question itself required careful handling. Ethan shifted slightly beside her, his discomfort visible in small ways, though he did not challenge her directly. I asked him quietly if he felt embarrassed. He answered quickly, almost too quickly, but there was a fraction of hesitation that lingered in the space between us. It was enough. We later sat together at a cafe inside the mall, where the conversation continued along the same path. Vanessa spoke about the future, about social circles, about the environments they would need to move within. She never spoke harshly, never directly criticized me, yet the message remained consistent. The life I had chosen did not align with the life she envisioned. As I listened, I realized this was not a series of passing comments. It was a pattern. Each remark was small, but together they formed something intentional. Vanessa was not reacting to me. She was redefining me. By the end of that day, I made a decision. I would not confront her. Not yet. There was more to understand, and I intended to see it clearly before anything changed. If you're starting to see the pattern forming and wondering where this is going, comment number 3 below. Now let's move on to chapter 4. In the days that followed, I continued my routine at the fruit stand as if nothing had changed. The same early mornings, the same careful arrangement of fruit, the same familiar customers passing by without a second thought. On the surface, everything remained steady, but beneath that calm, my awareness had sharpened. Vanessa's words were no longer isolated observations. They formed a pattern, and patterns, in my experience, always lead somewhere. I began noticing subtle changes in Ethan as well. He still visited, but not as often, And when he did, something about him felt slightly out of place. His conversations were shorter, his attention more divided. There were moments when he seemed present, and others when his mind was clearly elsewhere. I did not question him directly. I had learned long ago that pressure reveals more than interrogation ever could. Vanessa, on the other hand, became more direct in her intentions. She spoke frequently about the future, about investments, about positioning themselves in a way that reflected what she believed they were capable of achieving. The idea of purchasing a penthouse within Lakeview Galleria came up more than once. She described it not as a luxury, but as a logical step. According to her, opportunities like that did not wait for people who hesitated. Ethan responded with caution. He pointed out the obvious financial limitations, the reality of their situation. But Vanessa had a way of redirecting the conversation. She spoke about family potential, about resources that had not yet been explored, about possibilities that simply required the right perspective. It was not an emotional argument. It was structured, almost rehearsed. As I listened, I found myself remembering conversations from years ago, long before the mall reached its current state. I had encountered people like this before, individuals who did not see what was, but instead focused entirely on what they believed could be accessed. It was not curiosity, it was calculation. That realization settled quietly in my mind, and then, not long after, it was confirmed. One afternoon, I received a message from Daniel Harper, the financial advisor who had worked with our company for over a decade. His tone was careful, but direct. He informed me that someone had recently contacted a lending institution claiming to represent the Collins family. The inquiry involved loan eligibility based on property assets connected to Lakeview Galleria. I did not need him to say her name. Vanessa had moved beyond speculation. She had acted. For a moment, I stood behind the fruit stand, holding a crate of oranges, and let the information settle. There was no immediate anger, no outward reaction, only clarity. She believed access to wealth was within reach, and more importantly, she believed she had the right to move toward it without confirmation. Later that day, I met Daniel Harper in a small office above the mall. He expressed concern and suggested that Ethan should be informed. I listened, then declined, not because I dismissed the seriousness of the situation, but because I understood something he did not. Revealing the truth too soon would only interrupt the process. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are close to gaining what they want. I returned to the fruit stand that evening with a different perspective. What had once been a quiet unease had now become something else entirely. This was no longer just about Vanessa. It was about understanding how far she was willing to go and whether Ethan would recognize it before it was too late. If you feel like things just crossed a line and something serious is about to happen, comment number 4 below. Now, let's head into Chapter 5. The invitation came from Vanessa, though it carried the tone of something more formal than a simple family dinner. She chose one of the most refined restaurants inside Lakeview Galleria, a place known for quiet conversations and polished impressions. I accepted without hesitation. By then, I understood that moments like this do not arrive by accident. They are arranged. That evening, I closed the fruit stand earlier than usual and changed into a simple navy dress. Nothing extravagant, nothing that demanded attention. I walked through the mall at a steady pace, passing beneath the soft lighting that reflected off the glass storefronts. The familiar environment felt slightly different, as if I were seeing it from both inside and outside at once. When I arrived, Vanessa and her parents were already seated. The table overlooked the central atrium, offering a clear view of the space below. Ethan stood as I approached, his expression warm, but edged with something I recognized as tension. Vanessa greeted me with practiced ease, her posture composed, her confidence intact. Her parents were polite, observant, and quietly assessing everything around them. The first part of the evening moved as expected. We discussed work, daily routines, and small details that carried no real weight. I listened more than I spoke. Vanessa appeared comfortable, guiding the conversation with subtle control. She knew where she wanted it to go. It was not long before the topic shifted. She began speaking about real estate, about opportunities in the city, about properties that reflected a certain level of success. Her tone grew more animated as she described the penthouse units above the mall. She spoke about the view, the exclusivity, the sense of arrival that came with living in such a space. Ethan shifted slightly beside her. I noticed the change immediately. He did not interrupt, but his silence carried a different kind of weight. Vanessa continued, linking her enthusiasm to the future she imagined. She spoke about building a life that matched their potential, about stepping into environments that aligned with who they were becoming. Then, almost seamlessly, she brought Ethan's family into the conversation. She mentioned his father's involvement in the development of the mall, using it as a foundation for what she believed should follow. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. What had been discussion became implication. She turned toward me then, her expression calm, her voice measured. She spoke about moving forward, about how sometimes older ways of living no longer fit the direction of the next generation. The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was clear. Then she said it. She spoke about legacy, about what opens doors and what does not. Selling fruit, she suggested, was not the kind of foundation that created opportunity. The sentence was delivered without hesitation, as if it were simply a practical observation. For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of quiet conversation from nearby tables continued, but at ours, the air had shifted. I did not respond immediately. I allowed the silence to settle, to give her words the space they deserved. Then I reached into my bag and took out my phone. The movement was small, controlled, almost unremarkable. I placed a call and asked for someone to come to the restaurant. Vanessa watched me with mild curiosity, not concern. She had no reason to question it. Not yet. Within minutes, he arrived. His posture was professional, his expression respectful. When he addressed me, the tone he used did not belong to the version of me Vanessa believed she understood. The change at the table was immediate, though no one spoke. I looked at him calmly and asked a simple question. Who owns Lakeview Galleria? He answered without hesitation. My name. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Ethan stared at me, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. Vanessa did not move at first. It was as if the information had not yet reached her fully, but it did, and in that moment, everything changed. The silence that followed my name lingered longer than any argument ever could. It settled over the table in a way that made every movement feel heavier, every glance more deliberate. I did not rush to fill it. There was nothing I needed to explain immediately. The truth, once spoken, has its own weight. Ethan was the first to react, though even that came slowly. He looked at me as if trying to reconcile two entirely different versions of the same person. His expression shifted between confusion and disbelief, his thoughts clearly racing faster than he could organize them. I could see him searching for something familiar, something that still made sense. Vanessa, on the other hand, seemed frozen at first. Her posture remained perfectly still, but the confidence she had carried into the evening had disappeared. When she finally moved, it was subtle, almost cautious, as though she were unsure how the room itself might respond to her. Her parents adjusted more quickly. I noticed it in the way they sat, in the way their eyes returned to me, no longer with casual observation, but with measured attention. They were recalculating, reorganizing everything they thought they understood. I let the silence continue for a moment longer before speaking. I explained simply that I had never hidden anything. I had only chosen not to define myself by ownership. The mall existed because of years of work, but the fruit stand remained because it was where everything began. Wealth, I said, has a way of changing how people behave, and I preferred to see people as they were before that influence took hold. Ethan asked questions then, one after another, not aggressively but with quiet urgency. He wanted to know how long this had been true, why I had never told him, whether anyone else knew. I answered each one calmly. The timeline was not complicated. The reasoning was not dramatic. It was simply a choice. As he listened, I could see something shifting behind his eyes. Pieces of memory were rearranging themselves. The conversations he had shared with Vanessa, the pressure she had placed on him, the assumptions she had made about his family, all of it began to settle into a new pattern. Vanessa tried to speak, but her voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. She attempted to frame her previous comments as concern, as practicality, as an effort to plan for the future. Her words moved carefully, as if she were trying to rebuild something that had already collapsed. I did not interrupt her. I only watched. The question that mattered was not what she said now, but what she had believed before. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when she hesitated. It was not dramatic. Most people might have missed it, but I did not, and neither did Ethan. Before that silence could fully settle, her father leaned forward. His reaction came quickly, almost instinctively. He spoke about opportunity, about potential, about how impressive it was that everything here belonged to me. His tone carried admiration, but it was directed toward the situation, not the person. He suggested possibilities, partnerships, ways in which our families could benefit from working together. There was even a brief mention of financial arrangements, of how certain structures could be reconsidered in light of new information. It was subtle, but unmistakable. In that moment, the conversation revealed more than anything that had been said before. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression quieter now, more distant. He was no longer reacting to the surprise. He was processing what it meant. The future he had imagined was no longer aligned with the reality unfolding in front of him. I did not move. I did not need to. The truth had done exactly what it always does. It had not changed anything. It had only made everything visible. If that moment changed everything for you the way it did for me, comment number 6 below so I know you're still here. Now let's move on to chapter 7. The rest of the evening continued, but not in any way that resembled a real conversation. The shift at the table had been too complete, too final. What remained was only formality, the quiet effort of people trying to move through the end of something they no longer understood how to control. The restaurant still carried its soft lighting and low conversations, but at our table, everything felt distant. Vanessa no longer met my eyes. Her attention drifted between her glass and the tablecloth, her movements smaller, more contained. The confidence she had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by something far more cautious. Her parents, who had once engaged easily, now spoke less, their presence reduced to observation rather than participation. They had adjusted quickly, but even that adjustment carried a certain restraint. Ethan remained seated, but he was no longer truly part of the table. I could see it in the way he leaned back slightly, his posture no longer engaged, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He responded when necessary, but his words carried little weight. The conversation around him continued, yet he had already stepped away from it in his mind. No one addressed what had happened directly. There were no apologies that carried substance, no explanations that reached beyond the surface. Vanessa attempted, in small ways, to soften what she had said earlier. She spoke about intentions, about concern for the future, about wanting the best for both herself and Ethan. Her words were careful, but they lacked something essential. They were not rooted in understanding. They were shaped by the need to repair. I listened without responding. There is a difference between an apology that comes from reflection and one that comes from pressure. The first carries weight. The second fades as soon as the moment passes. Eventually, Ethan stood. The movement was quiet, almost hesitant, but it carried a clear intention. He stepped away from the table without explanation, leaving behind the conversation that no longer held meaning for him. I watched him go, noting the way his shoulders carried a different kind of tension than before. It was no longer confusion. It was recognition. Vanessa followed him shortly after. She moved quickly, but not urgently, as if trying to maintain control over something that was already slipping away. I did not follow. Some conversations are meant to happen without witnesses. From where I sat, I could see them at a distance, standing near the balcony that overlooked the mall. Their figures were outlined against the soft glow of the lights below. I could not hear what was said, but I did not need to. The space between them spoke clearly enough. Vanessa's posture was defensive, her movements sharper now, less controlled. Ethan remained still for the most part, listening, absorbing, deciding. I thought back to the first moment I had met her, to the way she had looked at the fruit stand, at my hands, at the space around her. It had not been curiosity. It had been classification. She had placed me somewhere in her understanding of the world, and everything that followed had grown from that single decision. There is a difference between not knowing and assuming. Not knowing leaves room for learning. Assuming closes that space entirely. And when assumption turns into judgment, it becomes something much harder to undo. When Vanessa returned to the table, her composure had been partially restored, but it no longer carried the same authority. Ethan did not return with her. He remained where he was, separated now not by distance, but by clarity. As I sat there, I did not feel anger nor satisfaction. What I felt was something quieter, confirmation. The truth had not created anything new. It had only revealed what had always been present. And now, whatever came next would depend not on what had been said, but on what Ethan chose to see. The morning after the dinner, the mall felt quieter than usual, though nothing about it had truly changed. The same stores opened on time, the same lights reflected off polished floors, and the same early customers passed by with their routines intact. I stood behind the fruit stand, arranging strawberries into small wooden baskets, letting the rhythm of familiar work settle my thoughts. Not long after, Ethan approached. I saw him before he reached me. His steps were slower than usual, his posture more deliberate. There was no hesitation this time, only a quiet seriousness that had not been there before. He did not greet me with his usual ease. Instead, he stood across from the counter, looking at me as if he were seeing something clearly for the first time. I waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried weight. He wanted to understand everything, not just what I owned, but why I had chosen to live the way I did. There was no accusation in his tone, only a need for clarity. I explained it simply. The fruit stand was never about necessity. It was about memory, about keeping a part of my life that mattered long before success took shape. I told him that wealth has a way of changing how people behave, how they listen, how they judge. By remaining where I started, I was able to see people as they truly were, without the influence of expectation. He listened without interrupting. I could see the pieces coming together for him, not just from the night before, but from everything that had led up to it. Vanessa's words, her questions, her assumptions. They were no longer separate moments. They formed a pattern that he could no longer ignore. After a while, I reached into my bag and took out my phone. I showed him a message that had been forwarded to me the previous day. It was an email Vanessa had sent to a real estate agent while inquiring about property within the mall. In it, she described me as a vendor, someone with no real influence over the property itself. The language was polite on the surface, but the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. Ethan read it slowly. His expression did not change immediately, but I could see the shift happening beneath the surface. This was not something that could be explained away or reframed. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a belief she had held long before any truth had been revealed. He handed the phone back to me without speaking. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The space between us felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when something has finally been understood. After some time, he spoke again, more quietly than before. He was not asking what he should do. He was thinking through what he already knew. There was disappointment in his voice, but not anger. Disappointment carries a different kind of weight. It lingers longer, settles deeper. I did not offer advice. I had learned that decisions made under pressure rarely hold. Instead, I told him only one thing. People do not change when circumstances change. They reveal themselves more clearly. He nodded, not quickly, but with the kind of understanding that takes time to form. As he stood there, I realized that the situation no longer needed explanation. The truth had already done its work. It had not forced a decision, but it had made one inevitable. And whatever choice Ethan made next, it would be his, shaped not by what he had been told, but by what he had finally seen. If you think you already know how this is going to end, or maybe you don't, comment number 8 below. Now let's move toward the final outcome of the story. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet sense of normalcy that felt almost deceptive. Lakeview Galleria continued its steady rhythm, unchanged by the events that had shifted everything beneath the surface. The same customers walked past my stand, the same conversations drifted through the air, and the same light filtered down through the glass ceiling each morning. On the outside, nothing had moved, but I knew that something essential had. I returned to my routine without interruption. There was comfort in it, not as a distraction, but as a reminder. The fruit stand had always been a place of clarity for me. It required patience, attention, and consistency, all things that reveal more about a person than any single decision ever could. Ethan did not come the next day, nor the day after. I did not reach out to him. Some decisions take time to settle, and interference only delays what must come naturally. I trusted that he would return when he was ready, not because he needed guidance, but because he had found his own. When he finally did, it was late in the afternoon. The mall was quieter by then, the energy of the day beginning to soften. I saw him approaching from across the corridor, and even from a distance I could tell something had changed. The uncertainty that had once followed him was gone. In its place was a calm that carried weight. He stopped at the stand and looked at me for a moment before speaking. There was no hesitation this time. He told me that he had ended things with Vanessa. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not. There was no anger in his voice, no attempt to justify the decision, only acceptance. He explained that what mattered most was not what she believed about money, but what she revealed about respect. He had thought at first that her concerns were about ambition, about building something more, but he had come to understand that her vision required him to distance himself from parts of his life that had shaped him, and that was not something he was willing to do. I listened without interruption. There was nothing I needed to add. The clarity in his voice told me that he had already worked through everything that mattered. Vanessa's absence did not need explanation. Her intentions, once subtle, had been made visible. Whatever future she had imagined was built on assumptions that no longer held. Her parents, who had once seen opportunity, had quietly withdrawn. Their interest had been tied to possibility, and without it, there was nothing left to pursue. Ethan did not speak about them with bitterness. That, more than anything, told me he had made the decision for the right reasons. Anger fades quickly. Understanding does not. As he stood there, I saw something I had been waiting for. Not relief, not victory, but growth. He was no longer reacting to the situation. He was responding to it with intention. He had chosen not just an outcome, but a principle. After a while, he reached for a piece of fruit, turning it in his hand the way he used to as a child. The gesture was small, almost instinctive, but it carried a quiet meaning. Some things do not need to be explained. When he left, I returned to arranging the stand. The work remained the same, steady and familiar. Around me, the mall continued as it always had. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything that mattered had. In the days that followed, life returned to its familiar rhythm, though I understood it differently now. Each morning, I arrived at the fruit stand before the mall fully opened, just as I always had. The light filtered through the glass ceiling, soft and steady, settling over the polished floors and quiet storefronts. I unlocked the counter, arranged the fruit, and prepared for another day that, on the surface, looked no different from any other. Customers came and went, some stopping to talk, others simply passing by. Their interactions were unchanged, and that consistency brought a certain comfort. It reminded me that the world does not pause for personal revelations. It continues, steady and indifferent, leaving us to carry what we have learned within it. I found myself thinking about Vanessa, not with resentment, but with a clearer understanding of who she was. She had not acted out of cruelty alone, but out of a belief system that placed value on status, appearance, and perception above all else. It was a way of seeing the world that I had encountered many times before. It was not rare, and it was not entirely without reason, but it was incomplete. It left no room for respect where there was no advantage. There is a difference between ambition and character. Ambition pushes people forward, encourages growth, and drives them to build something more. But character determines how they treat others along the way. Without it, ambition becomes something else entirely, something hollow and unsustainable. Ethan had come to understand that distinction. I saw it in the way he carried himself now, and the quiet certainty behind his decisions. He no longer spoke in terms of what he might gain, but in terms of what he was willing to accept. That change was not dramatic, but it was real. It came from seeing clearly, and once clarity takes hold, it does not easily fade. As for me, I remained where I had always been. The fruit stand was never a symbol of limitation. It was a reminder of origin, of effort, of everything that had been built without shortcuts or assumptions. It kept me connected to something real in a world that often measures worth in ways that are easy to misunderstand. Over the years, I had learned that people reveal themselves most honestly when they believe there is something to gain, not when they are comfortable, and not when they are certain, but in the moments when opportunity appears within reach. That is when intentions surface, quietly but unmistakably. I do not measure my life by what I own, even though I could. I measure it by what I chose to build, and by what I refuse to let change me. The mall, the stand, the years of work behind both of them, they are all part of the same story. And so I continue, arranging fruit each morning, greeting familiar faces, and watching the world move as it always has. Nothing about the place has changed. Only the way I see it has. In the end, what truly matters is not what people own, but how they choose to live and treat others when no one is watching. Status can impress, and ambition can build, but without respect and integrity, both eventually lose their meaning. Life has a quiet way of revealing truth, not through loud confrontations, but through small moments where character becomes impossible to hide. When everything is stripped down to its core, what remains is not wealth or image, but the values that guided each decision along the way. And those values shape not only outcomes, but the kind of life that feels worth holding on to. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it made you think or feel something, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories like this.